President Trump is now on his way to the Middle East, where he will stop in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, but not in Israel. The president's trip is under scrutiny for what appears to be his focus on business deals over diplomacy. The Trump administration also confirmed it's preparing to accept a $400 million luxury jet from Boeing that's going to be coming from the royal family of Qatar for President Trump to use as Air Force One while he's in office and then to be donated to his presidential library. Joining me now is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube and Dennis Ross, former special envoy for Mideast Peace and an NBC News foreign affairs analyst. He's also out with a new book titled Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. Courtney, I do want to start with you here. The president's going to be stopping in Qatar, which we know is gifting the president with a luxury jet. Aside from the ethical issues that may exist here, what sort of security issues, what risk could this pose?
Yeah, and while the Trump administration is insisting that they will follow all applicable laws, if in fact they take this luxury jet, $400 million Boeing jumbo jet from the Qatari royal family. But the reality is, Aaron, there's a lot more here at stake than just the ethical issues when you talk about actually getting this aircraft to essentially be a new Air Force One. And one of the biggest is retrofitting it or making sure that it is able to have the communications capability necessary for an Air Force One. Now, that would mean basically stripping parts of the aircraft out to provide the secure communication that the president would always need. Remember, he needs to have 24-hour access to nuclear command and control communications at the most secure level, no matter where he is, anytime, day or night. That includes while he's on an aircraft. But it's not just the secure communications. The possibility of taking an aircraft from a foreign national, a foreign government that is, even an ally, opens up the possibility that it could have listening devices or any kind of monitoring devices that would be embedded in. And Aaron, we're not talking about big devices that would be sort of hidden in the lampshades and things. We're talking about very small, very hard to detect, very sophisticated potential monitoring devices. The reality is, officials who we spoke to about this since this came out yesterday have said you would basically have to take that aircraft apart to ensure that there is nothing in there that could compromise the communications of the president and his closest advisors, Aaron.
Every screw, every bolt would have to be examined to make sure that it's not something that's pin-sized that could be used nefariously. Courtney, we also, obviously the president's going to the Middle East, right? But notably, he is not stopping in Israel on this trip. I know you have some reporting about tensions in this relationship between President Trump and the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. What more can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Aaron, look, it's not every president who goes to the Middle East doesn't automatically stop in Israel. But what's notable about the fact that the president is not going there on this trip is the fact that he came into office with the sense that he and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had this very close relationship, these close ties, and that they were really aligned on some of the most important issues about that the two nations share, and specifically about the threat from Iran and specifically from Iran's nuclear capabilities. And then also the war in Gaza. Well, since January 20th, when President Trump was sworn in, things have changed a bit, and their policies have really drifted apart. Specifically on Gaza, we are told, according to a number of officials, that President Trump was frustrated when Prime Minister Netanyahu restarted a military offensive in Gaza several weeks ago, that it was counter to what President Trump had talked about rebuilding Gaza. Also, we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu was frustrated last week when President Trump opened up the possibility that Iran could have some sort of a civilian and peaceful nuclear program. Aaron.
All right, Courtney Kube for us at the Pentagon today. Courtney, thank you. Let's turn to Ambassador Ross now. Ambassador, we know President Trump's first foreign trip during his first term was also to the Middle East, as it is this time around. What's top of mind for you with this particular trip this week? We know that things have changed significantly in that region in the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, I find what's interesting is just as his first foreign trip in 2017 was to Saudi Arabia, so is the first foreign trip this time to Saudi Arabia. Then as now, the priority was very much in the economic, financial dimension. It was very much focused on being able to announce major deals. Those major deals were both of weapon systems and of obviously projects that would be invested in. This time around, we will see something very similar. I think what it highlights is that the president, when he looks internationally, he thinks less about geopolitics and more about what are the economic gains to be won. And you will see on this trip in Saudi Arabia, then Qatar, and then the UAE, I think announcements with very large dollar figures about what will be invested here, American companies that may invest there. This is very much reflecting, I think, a worldview that says the way this president thinks about our place in the world is how can we benefit economically? How can I bring investments here? How can I have American companies investing there? It is focused more on that and less on the security dimensions of foreign policy. And I think we're seeing a replay of that. That's what this very much tells me as I look at this trip.
Well, I do want to ask you a little bit about the security dimensions of this. As you noted, there's a lot of geopolitical development in the Middle East as of late. We have the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. There's this apparent agreement between the U.S. and the Houthis to stop attacks. Talks between the U.S. and Iran as well. What do you make of this tactic that the administration seems to be using, not seeming to consult with Israel on many of these big issues in that region?
Well, it's a departure, for sure. Every administration, even ones that have been not necessarily characterized by really close relations with the Israelis, would still almost always coordinate with them, inform them in advance of big moves. Not always, but most of the time. Now, recently, we've seen Trump administration do a deal with the Houthis that affected only American ships. No attacks on Israel, no Houthi commitments not to attack Israeli ships or what they define as anything connected to Israel, and that's a very broad definition. A decision to negotiate with the Iranians that is announced in the presence of the prime minister without him knowing that was going to be the case. Decisions now, it appears, as part of the discussions with the Saudis, to take modernization or the development of a nuclear industry in Saudi Arabia, which was going to be part of a package in which the Saudis got that along with the defense treaty in return for they would do normalization with Israel. Now that's being extracted from that package and is going to stand on its own without any reference to Israel. So these are examples along with negotiating directly with Hamas, something that no administration previously did, but this one did, and the Israelis didn't know about it. So there's a pattern here of the president basically saying, where I define there's something in our interest, I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I don't feel duty-bound to have to somehow discuss it in advance with the Israelis or with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I think this is an interesting departure from what we've seen in the past.
I only have a few seconds here left, but I want to ask you about, over the weekend, we saw the U.S. and Iran held another round of talks. Which side do you think has more leverage going into these talks? Do you think they're any closer to a deal today, the U.S. and Iran?
We have dramatically more leverage. The Iranians are vulnerable because the Israelis took out all their strategic air defense, so they're very vulnerable to attack. On the inside, they have electricity shortages, even though they produce natural gas and oil. They have profound water shortages. They are in desperate need of a deal. So we have the leverage. The question is, what can we get out of this? I hope the objective is at the end of the day, Iran will be giving up its nuclear weapons option. All right. They can have civil nuclear power, but they can't preserve the option to be able to turn that into a weapon.
All right. Ambassador Dennis Ross, we appreciate your time and expertise on this. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.